There are very few more remarkable women than Barbara Sinatra. She was irreverent and she was terrific fun, and she never ever took herself too seriously. She treated her entire life as a great adventure, and it really had been. Frank was undoubtedly the love of Barbara's life. She absolutely adored him until the day she died, aged 90. She listened to his music every day, she visited his grave on all the anniversaries and birthdays, and she never ever dated again. When I asked her why she didn't, she said, "Who after Frank?" My name is Wendy Holden. We are sitting in my home in Suffolk, England. I'm a biographer and a journalist, and my passion is for remarkable women, and I wrote the Barbara Sinatra memoir, Lady Blue Eyes. I was asked to write a memoir by a Hollywood agent, and so I was flown to Los Angeles. The minute I met this woman who was in her 80s, but absolutely stunningly beautiful, an indomitable spirit, I fell in love with her, and it was a no-brainer. I was absolutely going to write it. Unfortunately, she felt the same way. When I write books about people, particularly these incredible people that have had a full life, I'm always fascinated where they came from. Barbara could not have come from anywhere more unlike where she ended up. She grew up in Bosworth, Missouri. It was a town of 500 souls. Her father was a butcher. He worked in her grandfather's general store. When she was 15, she first heard Frank Sinatra and loved his voice. She never in a million years thought she'd leave Bosworth, and she certainly never thought she'd end up being Mrs. Frank Sinatra. And the only reason she did leave that little town was because her mother persuaded her long-suffering husband to up sticks and move to California with her, and she took Barbara and her sister with them. After she moved to California, she married a nightclub singer called Bob Oliver and had her son Bobby, but Bob Oliver and she didn't get along. She ended up moving to Las Vegas, where she became a showgirl at the famous Riviera Club, which was attended by likes of Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Elvis Presley, Howard Hughes, and Zeppo Marx. Zeppo Marx was the youngest of the famous Marx comedy brothers. He spotted her high-kicking on stage, and he ended up persuading her to move to Palm Springs with him, where he had a house, and he married her, and her next-door neighbour, his next-door neighbour, was Frank Sinatra. Married to Zeppo, she was invited to parties, cocktail parties, poker games, golf tournaments, you name it, she went along and she got to know Frank, but it took him 10 years before he finally made a move on her, by which time her marriage to Zeppo was breaking down. And when he finally made a move on her, it was at a cocktail party hosted by an actress called Eva Gabor, and he kissed her, and she said from then on she didn't really have a choice. So she ended up leaving Zeppo and moving in with Frank in 1971, and she was with him from that day on. She was very much her own person, and you have to remember that when she met him she was in her 40s, so she'd been married twice by then. She wasn't just his dame, she was somebody who was a woman in her own right, and she very much knew her own mind. I think that was part of his attraction to her, was the fact that she was somebody who wasn't just going to say yes and do everything he wanted, and she was going to have her own input into how they lived and where they lived. Frank loved to treat Barbara, and he loved expensive, exquisite jewellery. He had a very fine eye. One night when they were about to go out in Monte Carlo and she was getting dressed, he came up behind her, dipped into his dinner jacket pocket and pulled out a very expensive diamond and emerald necklace which he draped around her neck. That necklace was so exquisite that her reaction was holy shit, and thereafter it was known as the holy shit necklace. Frank was the collector. Frank had a lot of money and he bought what he liked. Barbara really was the interior designer. She was the one that put that collection together in a subtle, clever, elegant way. They really loved art. I mean, both of them had a great passion for art. They loved beautiful things, and they loved statuary as well. They had quite a few statues around the house. Some of them were busts of Frank's head that people had either donated to him or he had commissioned or she had commissioned for him. The walls were surrounded with paintings and photographs and discs, gold discs and platinum discs. It was really a shrine to Frank. It had been that way when he was alive, and she had no intention of changing it after his death. In the guest rooms and in the room that I used to stay in, they were almost always adorned with Frank's own art. A lot of artists, whether they be singers, actors, writers, have that kind of left-brain creativity. He used art as a kind of therapy his whole life, and certainly their whole marriage. And when his mother died, for example, and he sank into a deep depression because he was very devoted to her, it was Barbara that persuaded him to go back into his studio and pick up his paintbrushes. Later in life, she decided to set up her own Barbara Sinatra Children's Centre in Palm Springs for children who had been sexually and physically abused, and that really became a huge passion of hers. Frank was extremely generous. He donated many of his paintings. He persuaded everybody else to donate paintings, and every year they held a charitable golf tournament that had a concert at the end of it, which raised millions. She never lost sense of where she came from, and she never lost the sense of not having any money ever, and being really worried about how she was going to feed her child. That was a big part of her life, and it never left her. And actually, in many ways, I don't think it left Frank either. They were extremely charitable their whole lives. I felt incredibly privileged to chronicle Barbara's memoir because it was a remarkable time in history, the tail end of the golden age of Hollywood. To look through the catalogue and see some of these pieces that absolutely signify that remarkable time in Hollywood history is a great privilege, and anybody who's able to get anything from this sale will have a little piece of history in their hands.